I felt my mouth go dry the instant she said it, her voice a lazy ribbon from the mask. Do grown-ups at your house play the statue game too? I kept working on the filling because I had to keep my hands steady, but I heard Emily freeze at my side and I felt my heartbeat speed up in a way that made me clench my jaw. Izzy, Lily on the chart, but she told me she was Izzy, looked at me with a grin that was too proud for a 7-year-old. She spoke like she was reading off a list of accomplishments, and I pretended the drill's hum covered how loud my head got. I slid her sleeve up with fingers that I forced to be gentle. I had done this 1,000 times, check the skin, note the color, look for pattern. What I saw was a faint yellow ring of bruising at the top of her arm that matched the size and shape of adult fingers. I held the kid's arm like it was china and asked, quiet and casual, you like games, huh? What else do you play? She told me her spoon record like it was a medal, 18 minutes. She puffed up at the memory, and I felt a cold like winter settle in my chest, because the number hung there like proof. Her back was the thing that really made me stop being clinical and start being human. When she lifted both arms to wiggle out of the mask, lines showed across her lower back, rows of pale scars, straight and even like someone took time to make them. I kept my voice easy, I had to. How do you win the statue game? I asked, acting like this was all normal small talk in a dental chair. Inside, I was already scrolling through procedures on my phone with my thumb, the screen bright and clinical. Emily watched me from the corner of my eye and I could tell she knew we weren't dealing with scraped knees. We freeze when Daddy's car comes, Izzy said, slow like she was practicing words that mattered. If you move, you have to go in the quiet room. My jaw tightened. The quiet room was something I'd heard about once in a forensic seminar, a place used to isolate a child for punishment. She said their names too, like this was a classroom recital. Mommy counts, Daddy checks, we try to be statues. Her pride in the rules made me imagine how small her chest must feel pretending to be brave on command. I kept working on the filling because moving too much would have spooked her and maybe erased what she was willing to say. I measured the bruises with a penlight and the inner ring of a glove like I do when documenting trauma. I asked where the spoon was kept and what the quiet room smelled like, soft and steady questions that made it easier for her to talk without fear. It smells like old bread and paint, she said, and I almost laughed from the absurdity of the detail, except I didn't, because laughing would have been obscene in that room. When she mentioned the closet under the stairs, it clicked for me in a way that made the clinic feel suddenly smaller. I thought of the times patients had asked why we had a locked storage room and of the corner where we kept the extra chairs. I was thinking of safety plans and immediate steps. I told Emily to start the paperwork like it was routine, and I dialed Child Protective Services from the hallway where the reception had a little window. My hands shook when I hit call, but the voice I used for the report was practiced and flat. Facts, dates, measurements, the direct quotes I'd gotten under the mask. While I reported, I kept my eyes on Izzy. She babbled about a kitchen timer and how long you could hold still before you were allowed to eat. She made me promise I wouldn't tell her parents I asked too many questions, and I promised because promises are small, safe things I can give people. I photographed the bruises with my phone on a clean background, took notes on a clipboard, and made sure the digital recorder one of my staff had slipped into the room was running. Every move was slow and precise because one wrong step could shift everything. By the time CPS said they were on their way, my voice was tired and my stomach a knotted thing. I told Izzy she did the right thing talking to me. She nodded like she'd done a chore and been handed a sticker. Emily kept her hand on Izzy's knee the way nurses sometimes touch patients to ground them. Outside in the waiting room, I could see a man who fit the profile of a father, broad shoulders, the wrong kind of watch, and my stomach flipped. I went back to the chair and stayed near, deciding then I would do every small, stubborn thing it took to keep that child safe, even if it meant waking up courts and strangers and long nights of testimony. She told me the rules like she was reading a list of chores, and I kept my voice flat so she wouldn't stop. We played the listening game, Izzy said, and then she said the answer like it was a spell, Daddy. Her eyes were proud when she said it like she'd learned something important. I asked, quiet, what happens if someone says something else? She shrugged like it was nothing and then dropped the hammer, you don't get dinner. My stomach dropped at that, because kids don't bargain for food unless they've been taught hunger as punishment. She kept going, small words that put together a big picture. If you move when the car comes, you go in the quiet room. She looked at me and almost smiled like she was telling me a secret about rewards. It's under the stairs, no light, you have to wait until you're sorry. The way she said sorry made it sound like the thing to be earned by pain. I asked how long, acting like the question was about math. She brightened up, proud at the scale of the thing she could endure, 8,000 seconds. She counted on her fingers, precise and serious. That's like a lot. She said it like bragging about a high score. I kept pretending to work on the filling because sudden movements would scare her into shutting down. The room smelled like the usual clinic, fluoride hand sanitizer, the bleach edge of clean, and under that was something colder that felt like a shadow. I checked her shoulders and she winced when I touched them, a blink and a small recoil that told me more than her words. I asked her to open her mouth so I could rinse her, and when she did I saw the inside of her cheek had little crescent scars, places where skin had been bitten in anger or fear. I swallowed and kept my voice steady. "You're doing good, Izzy. You're safe here for now," I told her, because that was the only truth I could hand to a 7-year-old in a dental chair. Emily made a tiny motion with her chin toward the waiting area, a signal we use when something's wrong and we can't scream it across the room. There he sat, a big man with shoulders that leaned forward even in the chair, hands always moving to his watch like he was measuring his readiness. He kept checking it over and over, eyes flicking up at the door like a clock watcher. I felt my chest tighten watching him. I excused myself with a calm voice and muttered about needing images taken. And then I stepped into the hallway and called CPS on my personal phone because telephone protocols in trauma cases are a mess, and I wanted the quick line. On my phone, I read the steps I'd rehearsed in my head for years: document, photograph, report, support. I gave the reporter my name, my title, the child's chart number, and the straightforward facts: the games, the bruises, the scars, the quiet room. I heard a voice on the other end ask for my contact and tell me they'd send someone. I told them as much detail as I could, and I kept my voice steady because someone on the other end needed something concrete they could use in a legal world that runs on specifics. When I hung up, I looked at my hands and realized they were still trembling from the call. Back at the chair, I measured the bruise on her arm with a penlight and a tape measure because photographs without scale don't mean much later. The grip bruises looked like adult fingers, roughly 3 centimeters across, and that told me the hand wasn't a child's. I wrote it down, precise and unemotional on paper that would later have to hold weight in court. "Do you know why people have to be statues?" I asked to keep her talking, to keep the details coming while we waited for help. She said, almost dreamy, "So Daddy won't get mad." The simplicity of that sentence felt like glass breaking in my chest. We kept a small routine while we waited. Emily hummed a meaningless song, I kept talking about silly things like what cartoons she liked, and Izzy answered in ways that occasionally drifted back to the rules she lived by. She told me the sound of Daddy's car like it was a bell and said that sometimes Mommy would make them practice being statues to get it right. The more she spoke, the clearer the pattern got: systematic, rehearsed, and cruel. I wanted to burst out and drag that man from the waiting room by his collar, but that's not my job. My job was to record, to preserve, to make sure what she said had weight outside that fluorescent room. When CPS and the police arrived, I walked them through everything in a voice stripped of drama. I handed over photos, notes, and the recording Emily had made when she couldn't look away. A social worker took Izzy's hand like a promise and told her they were going to help. Izzy looked back at me with a small, uncertain smile, like I'd been a safe island for a few hours. I stood in the doorway and watched the man in the waiting room fold into himself as officers approached. And I felt the slow, raw relief that comes when an awful secret finally gets witnessed by people who can do something about it. I went back into the room and tried to be as ordinary as possible because kids notice when adults change. I sat down, turned the x-rays to a bigger screen so it looked like a normal step, and handed Izzy a sheet of stickers to choose from while keeping the drills hum in the background. She peeled a star and stuck it to her sleeve like that was the most important thing in the world. I kept my voice low and steady and asked about school and cartoons, the small talk that makes a child relax. Inside, my hands were full of notes and my mind was already running through next steps. But I kept everything in even, simple tones so she wouldn't tighten up again. She told me quietly that they only ate if they won the statue game and that nobody who moved got dinner. Her voice didn't sound hungry, it sounded used to the rule. Then softer, like it was a secret she worried might be taken away, she said that sometimes Mother would slip her crackers later when no one was watching. That line hit me like a small, sharp stone because it told me there were moments of kindness and that someone knew how wrong it was. I said that was nice, because it was the only honest thing I could say in the moment and because I wanted her to keep talking. Her small smile lasted a second and then she looked down at her hands as if counting something only she could see. At the doorway I could hear the receptionist answering a question about wait times, and then a voice I'd already felt in the room, the father's, asking the receptionist how much longer his daughter would be. The voice was ordinary, like the question was nothing, and because the clinic echoes, you could hear people half a room away. He came to the doorway once, leaned there like he owned the frame, and Izzy froze without being told. Her body went still like the statue she'd described. She didn't move a muscle. Her eyes looked at him, but her whole face turned the color of listening. I watched that tiny scene and knew then that sight was proof in the easiest way. The man's shadow in the door and a child who became stone at the sound of his presence. I told Emily with one quick look to keep the door in view and to be ready. I put on a professional face because sometimes appearances calm people down and sometimes they make evidence cleaner. I stepped into the hallway and called CPS again from my clinic line even though I'd already used my phone. I used the script I knew, facts first, then what I had observed. I said his name if I had it, described the waiting room moment, and added that the child physically froze when he entered the doorway. The woman on the line said that confirmed our belief this needed immediate attention and that they were dispatching someone with police. I felt the slow relief that comes from moving a plan forward, but also that brittle fear that comes with knowing these next minutes are dangerous for a small life. Back inside, I documented everything carefully because when the legal system gets involved, sloppy notes disappear. I took photographs of the bruises next to a ruler, saved the x-rays with timestamps, and wrote down Izzy's exact words about the quiet room and 8,000 seconds. I gave a paper copy of everything to the intake desk and asked the receptionist to log the time the father had checked in and how long he had waited. I tried to be clinical while my chest worked like a bellows, pushing air in and out. I told Izzy she could stick as many stickers as she wanted, and she did, making a little constellation down her arm that looked like armor. When officers arrived, they moved quietly and respectfully, exactly as I hoped adults in those roles could be. A social worker with a soft voice came in and knelt to Izzy's level and asked her if she wanted to come with them to tell more, and Izzy looked like a small island deciding whether to leave safety. She took the social worker's hand, not because she trusted her, but because she seemed safe in the same way a blanket feels safe when you're small. I walked the team through my notes, handed over the photos and the recording Emily had made without thinking, and told them about the man in the doorway. They nodded and did what they had to do. Standing there, I felt a flood of things: anger, relief, exhaustion, but mostly I felt the quiet steadiness that comes when you do the thing you were meant to do. They came in through the staff entrance while Emily kept watch on the lobby like we'd practiced for other emergencies, and I felt both relief and a new kind of fear when I saw uniforms move past the glass. I stayed calm on the outside because panic would scare Izzy, and calm is a tool I've had to learn to use on the job. A CPS worker with a gentle face crouched down by the chair and introduced herself as Jenna Collins, and I watched Izzy track Jenna's badge with unfocused eyes like a little compass finding north. Jenna talked about crayons and a playroom in a voice that sounded like it could soften stone, and that voice made Izzy swing her feet for the first time without tensing like a trapped animal. I walked with them to the back exit because it felt right to be close when a child you've started to trust leaves your space. Izzy didn't look back at the waiting room. Instead, she kept her eyes on Jenna's hand. Her small feet bumped the floor as they moved, and her gum-cheeked face looked thinner than when she'd arrived. I felt the weight of months collapse into this thin hallway where fluorescent light made everything feel too loud. When they led her away, I kept my hands empty, because hands with things in them feel like a litany of things you could lose. Once Izzy and Jenna were out of sight, I stood in the hallway with the detective and the CPS team and unloaded everything I had. I told them about the games she'd named, the quiet room under the stairs, and the exact words she'd used about being sorry. I handed over photographs that showed the bruise patterns beside a ruler, explained the 3-centimeter grip marks that matched an adult hand, and gave them copies of x-rays with timestamps. I placed my notebook on the table so they could read the direct quotes I'd written as she spoke. I told them about the linear scars on her back and the bite scars inside her cheek, and I felt my voice steady as I recited each fact because the facts were something the law could hold. Emily, who had been small and quiet beside me all morning, gave the detective a phone with a recording on it and nodded toward me. She de-slipped a recorder into the room while she pretended to rearrange supplies, and the tape had captured Izzy's words in a way my notes couldn't. I watched the detective listen with a face that folded into concentration and then into action. They thanked me in the clipped, professional way people do when they mean it, and I could hear keys hit and radios buzz as they arranged to get to the house that afternoon. Their movement was fast, the kind of speed that tells you a child's safety is a time-stamped thing. The detectives left with the file I'd made and a look at the father's name from our intake form. I watched them go, thinking of how thin the air felt when you hand evidence to people who can act. Later that day, I learned what they found when they searched the family home, and the things they brought back made my stomach turn because they matched the quiet story Izzy had told in the chair. They found the little closet under the stairs where the wood inside was gouged with small scratches like nails trying to make light out of dark. A kitchen timer sat on the countertop where it had been used over and over, and someone had written numbers on the wall near the stairs like they were keeping score. They photographed the scratch marks and took the timer as evidence and recorded notes about the smell and the dust in the little room. They also found paperwork and medical notes that corroborated past injuries, and a journal in the father's office that read like a log of punishments with times, outcomes, and an inhuman tone of experiment. The detective later told me those things mattered more than anything I could say in a chair because they tied words to place and pattern. I spent the afternoon answering questions on the phone and filling in gaps for the police reports, repeating the same simple things in the same calm voice, so it would stitch together into a coherent story for someone who had to take action. When the house was secure and the kids were placed in emergency care that evening, I sat in the empty clinic room and let the day hit me. My hands finally stopped shaking and I felt hollow in a way that wasn't empty, more like the space inside a bell after the clapper has been removed. Emily and I went over the paperwork again because the legal world needs tidy boxes and clean lists, and because when the dust settles you realize detail is what keeps the truth from being rearranged. I filed copies, labeled photographs, and saved the recording in 3 places. I told myself I'd done the job the way it needed to be done, but I also knew a child had slept that night because a team moved fast, not because one person felt better. I tried to eat pasta, but the fork felt like an accusation in my hand. Every bite slid around until I set it down and stared into the plate. The kitchen light felt too sharp, and my mind replayed Izzy counting in the dark like a metronome for punishment. I could still hear the soft scrape of fingernails on the closet door from the photos the detectives showed me later, and those small sounds were louder than anything else in the house. I kept thinking about the mother, Marina, on the charts, who looked like someone folded too many times to be whole, and how small she became when she admitted how scared she was to refuse him. I saw the way she blinked when detectives asked simple questions, like she'd been taught silence for safety. My head filled with scenes of a little boy named Paul learning not to cry because crying might make him lose dinner. Those images stacked inside me like a list I couldn't close. My partner found me sitting at the table and put both hands on my shoulders like a steadying hand on a ship's rail. I hadn't meant to cry, but the tears came anyway, hot and stupid, and she held me while I let them. She said nothing heavy, just held me and let the house be what it was for a while, a safe place to be broken. The smallness of that quiet human presence kept me centered in a way the rest of the night couldn't. I tried to sleep after that, but every sound in the quiet house felt like a cue in the clinic, a phone ring signaling a call to duty. My mind flipped through logistics as if sleep were a spreadsheet. Custody hearings, emergency shelter bed availability, court timelines and paperwork, therapy referrals, and the names of people I'd probably have to see in court. Every item had a weight to it, and every weight pressed on the same part of my chest where I felt useless until I acted. Dawn came thin and gray, and I drove the 5 minutes to the clinic because doing something concrete was better than sitting with all those images. I walked through the doors and began making a list with the same focus I use when I chart a treatment plan. What fails needs fixing, and the fixes need to be fast. I called in the office manager, asked Emily to gather staff, and made a map of the rooms with little red circles where panic buttons needed to go. I wanted anyone in a patient chair to be able to hit one and know the office would flood with help. We ordered new locks for the back doors and rekeyed everything so former visitors couldn't walk in off the street. I put in a request for motion-activated cameras pointed at the lobby and locked storage for sensitive files so no one could tamper with intake records. I ran drills with the staff where we practiced who would call first, who would calm a child, and which exits were safest. The drills felt absurd in their domesticity but necessary. Small procedures form a backbone when the world tilts. The clinic added a security guard named Arjun, a solid ex-cop with broad hands and the kind of calm that comes from too many long nights. He took up the lobby position and checked the front door with the attention of someone who'd seen what happens when a man waits too long. He learned names fast and smiled slow when he introduced himself to families, which made the place feel like it had a spine now. Arjun's presence made me breathe easier because danger felt less anonymous with someone watching who knew how to move fast. I told the team I'd testify if needed, that I'd sit in court under bright lights and tell the same plain facts repeatedly until a judge believed them. I filed copies of the photos and recordings in 3 different places because losing evidence is one way things get softened by time and argument. I also made a list of resources for Marina and the kids, an emergency shelter with intake hours, local therapists who take our referrals quickly, and a nonprofit that would help with food and housing applications. The strange thing that night and that dawn was how small decisions added up into saving people. A single phone call from a dental chair changed a family's trajectory in 11 minutes, and the ripple from that call put systems into motion. I kept thinking about the kid's teeth, a small, measurable piece of health, and how it was the entry point that let me see the deeper harm. That idea stayed with me. Small openings can let big things out, and small actions can keep the doors closed. Detective Hayes called me down to the station, and I went because when a badge asks, you go. They sat me in a small room with a table full of photos and a folder that smelled like dust and coffee. The first picture made my stomach drop. A 3-foot by 4-foot closet with claw marks and child scratches burned into the wood like someone had tried to make air with fingernails. The detective watched my face while I looked, like he needed to see whether what he showed me landed the way it should. They spread more photos out, a kitchen timer with fingerprints on the buttons, a notebook from the father written in neat columns that read like a lab log, times, behaviors, notes on compliance, rewards and punishments listed like an experiment gone wrong. The words were calm and precise and made the room colder in a way I couldn't have predicted. I felt a little dead inside looking at a page where cruelty had been measured in minutes and outcomes. Detective Hayes used plain language and asked simple questions, the kind that make small details matter later in court. Then they showed medical records that made me want to leave the table. Old rib fractures noted in a pediatric chart, burn-like scars on Izzy's legs, records from previous ER visits where explanations read like accidents that never quite fit. Each image pushed my stomach into my throat and the air in the room felt thick, like someone had closed a window on daylight. I kept my face level because my job was to give them the facts and let the facts do the work. Detective Hayes nodded and said, "We need your diagrams, Mark. We need your measurements." So I drew. The detective gave me a clean sheet and a pencil, and I sketched the bruises as best as I could remember them under the mask and the office lights. I marked sizes with a ruler, noted colors, and wrote down healing stages, yellow for older bruises, purple for fresher ones, because that kind of detail is what turns an observation into evidence. I wrote dates that matched the timestamps from the x-rays and the dental chart. Filling that page felt like building a bridge from the dental chair to the courtroom. Every line was careful because sloppy lines let doubt in. They asked about the recording Emily had made and I replayed it for them in the room, letting Izzy's small voice fill the station while detectives listened with intent faces. Hearing her words again was like reliving the moment but stronger because now other people were listening with the power to follow up. Detective Hayes thanked me and told me they'd be filing charges and that they'd let me know about subpoenas. The word subpoena felt heavy in the air. It meant my name would appear under oath, that I'd tell the same plain story to judges and lawyers later on. While I sat at the table drawing and answering questions, I kept thinking about Marina. The detectives had her name from intake forms and had tried to reach her a few times. Later, when I finally spoke with her on the phone, she called from a shelter line and sounded like someone who had been small for too long. Her voice trembled with a mix of relief and shame as she explained how it had started like small games and slowly swallowed their days. She said she enforced rules because she was terrified of what would happen if she didn't, and that confession made something in me ache. Marina told me about nights she'd told the kids to be quiet when she heard the house settle, about the forced practices she'd carried out with a timer because the father demanded a perfect score. She said she'd learned to read his moods like weather and that when storms came, everyone got smaller. I listened and kept my voice plain and steady as a man with a duty, because steady words are sometimes the only safe thing someone has. She asked what would happen next, and I told her plainly about CPS steps in court, about safety plans and therapy options I knew would help. Detective Hayes asked me to stay available and to add anything else I remembered to the file, so I did, sending over copies of my notes and the clean diagrams I'd drawn. I felt both worn out and oddly focused, like a tool set back into service after doing the right thing. The detectives were good at their work. They moved with a kind of quiet that meant they had seen similar harm before and knew how to follow the thread. Even so, each new piece of evidence I handed over felt like a small, stubborn victory against something that had been meant to stay hidden. That week I sat through more debriefs and prepped for court testimony while the case moved forward. Every time I thought of the tiny closet and the timer and Izzy counting in the dark, my jaw clenched. I held to the simple truth I'd been living: facts, careful documentation, and willingness to act matter. People who can't protect themselves sometimes need someone to notice and to refuse to look away, and that morning in the dental chair started a sequence that would change lives. I kept telling myself that the right small things, done in time, add up to keeping children safe. The legal world moved into motion like a machine too big to see all at once, and I found myself swept up in the parts that needed my hands. I sat in rooms where cameras blinked, and a woman from the prosecutor's office went through the case with a steady voice, teaching me how to answer questions without volunteering feelings. She said, "Stick to facts, Mark. Dates, colors, sizes, don't fill in gaps with guesses." I practiced the lines out loud until they sounded flat and reliable, because I wanted my words to be tools in a courtroom, not flourishes that could be attacked. Forensic interviews were set up for the kids in kid-friendly rooms that somehow smelled like crayons and quiet authority. Professionals asked careful questions and let the children lead their own memories without pressure. Those interviews helped make the story into legal evidence, which is a strange, necessary change from the small, human story I'd heard in a chair. Criminal charges followed and the father posted bail, which felt like a bad joke at the time. A man out on money while the kids slept in strangers' beds. He managed to violate his release terms not long after and was picked up again, this time in cuffs that meant the police were taking the orders seriously. Eventually, the case moved toward a negotiated end. The plea deal was not everything anyone hoped for, but it did what the system can do best sometimes. It removed him from daily life, promised prison time for several years, required him to register as an offender, and stripped him of parental rights permanently. There was also a restraining order that would keep him from contacting the children for a long time. Hearing that sentence in court felt like a slow, stuttering relief. It wasn't full justice to me, but it was tangible safety, a number of years and a legal barrier that would buy time for healing. Marina's path was different and harder in ways that aren't always seen in headlines. CPS laid out strict conditions for reunification: parenting classes, therapy, random home checks, and supervised visitation schedules that felt clinical but were meant to be safe. Marina went to therapy sessions and parenting classes with the hunger of someone who wanted to be allowed to be a parent without terror. She began working nights stocking shelves at a grocery store so she could keep daytime availability for supervised visits and to save for a small apartment. She moved like someone crawling toward independence, slow and careful, counting each pay period, and each class attended like a step forward out of a storm. The kids were placed together in emergency foster care to keep them from fracturing and to preserve whatever family felt left. They had full dental and medical exams as soon as they arrived, and we coordinated with pediatricians and therapists to make sure nothing about their care was missed. At first they were guarded, their eyes learning where to trust. Over weeks and months, small things started to shift. Paul let out a shy laugh at a joke he wasn't sure he deserved, and Izzy picked purple in a box of crayons with a fierceness that looked like reclaiming a small pleasure. They ate messy dinners that didn't require perfection, dropping food and giggling when it hit the floor, and those little moments felt enormous. I was called to testify more than once, and I sat in front of lawyers with bright lights in my face and told the same quiet facts I'd written down in the clinic: sizes, colors, quotes. Cross-examination was its own work. The defense tried to poke holes in phrasing and timing, and the prosecutor coached me through remembering dates instead of impressions. Standing there, I felt a coiled energy, tired from nights thinking and ready because the case needed me to stay exact. Every truthful answer seemed to cut a little more away from the father's false normal and make space for the kids to breathe. Outside the courtroom, the clinic kept changing too. We kept the new locks, the panic buttons, and Arjun the guard who learned the kids' names and how to crouch and make themselves small for shy visits. Staff rotated weeks on and off because exhaustion is real when you spend days rushing between normal appointments and high-stakes reporting. We got thank you notes from neighbors and ugly anonymous threats in the mail, and the community's kindness helped balance those darker things. Local groups offered counseling vouchers, clothes for the kids, and a few people volunteered to sit with Marina while she filled out housing forms. That kindness added up. When the legal chapter reached its end with the plea and sentencing, it felt like closing a door on one room in a house. The house still had broken windows, but it was locked now and people were working to replace the glass. The children stayed in care while Marina met each step required for supervised reunification, and I watched those steps like a cautious friend. Small victories piled up. A child's laugh, a safe apartment lease signed with a little money saved, a visit that went without panic. It reminded me that the law can remove danger, but rebuilding a life is a slow thing that needs steady hands and ordinary kindness. I kept to my part, testifying, teaching other reporters what to look for and staying available, because once you see how a child's normal gets shaped into a weapon, you don't get to look away. Months after that first appointment, Marina called one morning and told me she had a key to a tiny transitional apartment. She sounded tired but steady, and she said there were no dark closets and the landlord had changed the locks. She'd bought nightlights for the kids so they wouldn't be afraid at night, and she laughed softly when she explained how Paul insisted on a dinosaur light that cast big teeth across the ceiling. That laugh felt like proof that the small pieces of life could come back. The kids settled into routines the way thin branches lean into wind and then hold steady. Paul and Izzy started therapy with people who knew how to ask questions without pushing, and they learned ways to name feelings that weren't punishments. Marina attended parenting classes and met with her social worker to show progress. The visits from supervised to unsupervised grew longer in slow, careful steps because she met each requirement, and the people who watched the visits reported calm behavior and safety. I kept my role small and steady. I testified in court whenever the system needed my voice, and I worked with the prosecutor to make sure my words were factual and tight. Sitting under bright lights and answering questions felt tiring, but hearing the judge read the sentence felt like a tile put back into place in a house we were trying to rebuild. The legal result wasn't everything, but it was a barrier that made the day-to-day safer for the kids while Marina found footing. At the clinic, I began training other mandated reporters because what I saw once could be seen again by someone else who knew the signs. I taught simple steps. Look for what kids call games, note patterns of bruises, make clear, dated notes, and call CPS. We practiced how to document without hysteria and how to hold facts like tools, not weapons. The people I trained were mostly nurses and school counselors, and I watched them learn the same careful language I had rehearsed in my head for months. I kept Izzy's bright crayon drawing in a locked drawer at my desk, folding it under copies of the chart notes like a small talisman. It was a picture full of purple and sun and a crooked house where the door was open. Sometimes I would open the drawer between patients and stare at the crayon marks for a second. It reminded me why we did what we did, not for praise or for headlines, but for small proofs that a life could tilt back toward ordinary things like crayons and bedtime stories. One Tuesday, they walked into the clinic smiling like a family that had learned how to do calm. Marina mouthed, "Thank you," from the doorway, and her eyes were wet in a way that showed exhaustion and relief at once. Izzy ran to the toy box and picked a purple crayon she'd clearly stashed for herself, then came back and asked if she could pick a sticker before the cleaning. Paul stood close to his mother and laughed at something silly Emily said, that shy laugh that had taken months to come back. When Izzy opened wide for the cleaning, her gums looked healthy and there were no new bruises or scars to document. I worked with my usual quiet motions and kept my voice light because this was a routine visit, not a forensic one. The whole experience felt ordinary in a good way. A child getting clean teeth, a mother present and steady, staff moving like a machine that had learned how to hold a small life gently. There was no drama, only slow, steady work that had been happening outside this chair for months. The relief I felt in that moment was small and sharp, like a breath held too long and then finally let out. It felt like a kind of justice that isn't loud, paperwork filed, court orders enforced, a family given tools to keep each other safe. We had interrupted something horrific and made room for repair, and that room was full of small, ordinary things: nightlights, crayons, messy dinners, a shaky laugh. I folded up Izzy's chart and wrote a short note about next visits, and then I locked the drawer with the crayon picture inside, as if closing a door that had been opened at just the right time.